Well, on to the other big story. India's telecom regulator has issued a consultation paper to debate whether or not OTT services such as WhatsApp, Skype and others should be brought under the regulatory regime. Now, the consultation paper aims to discuss changes that may be required in the current regulatory framework to govern these entities. Now, it talks at length about issues such as security, issues such as quality of service, such as consumer grievance redressal, issues of even data localization, speaking in terms of jurisdiction, and makes a case, at least the consultation paper appears to be making a case that there is, in fact, a case made out for perhaps greater intervention on the regulatory front. It also speaks of how perhaps there could be a bias in terms of the regulatory framework in favor of the OTT services and against the telecom service providers. But those are questions that have now been thrown open to the public. The public has time till December 12th to come back with the answers. But of course, we're also trying to get the answers to discuss this issue further. We have with us the editor and founder of Media Nama, Nikhil Pava, telecom expert Mahesh Uppal, and Director General of Cellular Operators Association of India, Mr. Rajan Mathews. Mr. Mathews, let me come to you first. Your first take as far as TRAI's assessment is concerned. It argues that, at least appears to be arguing that there is a regulatory imbalance in favor of the OTTs. Is that something that perhaps needs correction now? Mr. Mathews.
Yes, certainly. We've all along, as far back as 2 to 3 years ago, highlighted the imbalance in terms of similar service and similar regulations and rules, creating a unlevel playing field. And we are glad now that the TRAI has brought this forward. And it is articulated that on an all-data network, these issues have greater clarity that is required in this particular situation. So I think we support the discussions that have been raised by the regulator, and we believe that the issue of a level playing field, which has been raised by the regulator himself, requires careful thought and scrutiny at this particular point.
Interesting first thoughts that from Mr. Rajan Mathews. He supports the functionality-based distinction as far as these services are concerned, and hence seeking similar regulatory burdens. Mr. Uppal, let me come to you. That as we discuss this issue further, as we look at TRAI contemplating, let's get the technicalities out of the way. Let's talk about the likes of WhatsApp, Skype, etc. Those are the apps that are likely to be affected. Are we perhaps at a risk of widening the ambit of the regulatory mechanisms in a manner that perhaps the whole of the internet and the services that are made available would then become vulnerable to regulatory overreach? Is that a concern, that by way of perhaps looking to regulate WhatsApp, we could very well end up with a regime where the government, where the regulator perhaps has a very strong arm over the internet itself?
I fear you're right. I think there is that risk. And I think the TRAI is well within its rights to conduct this consultation. But I fear that the basis on which it is doing so is problematic. And the reason is the following, that while on the face of it, these services that we are talking about, let's say WhatsApp messaging as well as the telco's messaging service, seem similar in functionality, they are actually, the services are provided under entirely different circumstances. The services that the OTT players such as WhatsApp and Skype and various other players, the kind of services they provide are impossible to provide without access to the telco's network. In other words, to argue that telcos who control the provision of these services are somehow the peers of people who are providing services on that network, I believe, is a flawed argument. And I also think that it is a slippery slope, as you seem to indicate, because it's very difficult to differentiate communication services from the rest of the internet. A whole lot of services today, ranging from gaming to matrimonial services, to dating services, to financial services, all of them have a component of messaging. Now, few people, or indeed telephony, few people would suggest that these are somehow comparable to or in competition with the telco services. I completely agree that there is actually a crisis in this telco space, and that needs to be addressed. But the crisis, to a large extent, is not the making of the OTT players, but that of the telcos themselves. The kind of price wars we have seen in the telco space is something that it would be untenable to argue is something that is being created by OTTs or players such as those. It is in fact something that actually is the result of intense price competition, which is hurting margins. But I think the way to support telcos in their crisis is not to actually regulate the internet or the providers of communication services, etc., that OTTs provide.
Right.
So I think the TRAI
let's take a cue
has
from
gone
that,
up
what
the
Mr.
wrong
was telling us.
path.
Yes. Right, let's take a cue from that, Mr. Pawar. Let me come to you.
The TRAI has gone up.
Using the argument that Mr. Uppal had forwarded, that as far as the telcos are concerned, it's essentially a pipeline, in the nature of a pipeline. So it can't necessarily be compared to online services. So just your quick thoughts on this move by the TRAI. Is that a worry that you also share, that perhaps it could go far beyond just the likes of WhatsApp and Skype?
So look, I think over the last year or so, the TRAI has been trying to change its role from being just a telecom regulator to a digital regulator. And we've seen that in, for example, them pushing in a regulation that Apple needs to include its app in the App Store, the TRAI app, whereas it has no jurisdiction over the internet. So it's a telecom regulator, not an internet regulator. But what's happening is that through this means it's almost like the TRAI is trying to bring in internet regulation through the back door of telecom regulation. And I think this is a dangerous move because the internet is unregulated. I know that President Macron has called yesterday for the regulation of the internet, but that's something which needs to be looked at a government level, and hopefully the governments across the globe will not do that. This is not a TRAI mandate. I'm very, very clear about that. The other thing is that what you need to realize about the internet is that all users are created equal on the internet. The data packets don't distinguish whether you are service belonging to one service provider versus another provider, whether it's a multi-billion-dollar behemoth or it is a student in a village. All apps are created equal, and that creates equal opportunity for people to create. The same opportunity lies with the telecom operators, but the infinite competition that exists on the internet means that they are unable to beat those larger players or even the more innovative players. The solution to the telecom operators' problems lies in innovation, and they need to innovate in the telecom space. And we need an unbundling of the internet with services which are provisioned on the internet versus those which is an access service, which is you're providing a gateway or a road to some place. You might also be having a shop over there, but your power of controlling that road shouldn't force users to only go to your shop. Or you shouldn't have a regulatory advantage given to you just because your business is suffering from a situation of massive competition because of the entrance of Jio.
Let's get Mr. Mathews in on that. Mr. Mathews, we've had two of our panelists at least expressing some concerns, apprehensions with respect to design and the structure of the suggestions that have been made by way of this consultation paper, that a distinction needs to be made, that the telecom service provider is the one that needs to undertake innovation, that it is in the nature of a pipeline. How would you respond to these concerns that perhaps this plan, this proposal could be a little far-fetched? Mr. Mathews.
So, Ashwin, I think, first of all, these are all red herrings which we heard often enough, and these fears are always trotted out. Let's start off with the proposition that net neutrality is the law of the land. It's been recommended by TRAI, and it's been adopted by the DOT. And by the way, the Telecom Commission has been changed to the digital communication, so that should put to rest some of this verification in terms of are we telecom, are we digital. We have specifically mentioned in the TRAI discussion paper that we are in a new world of all digital IP related networks, and so these old divisions and classifications have gone by the wayside. And I think the regulator has specifically mentioned in the discussion paper that it's not about Jio coming in, and yes, those are issues of a financial nature. The issue is saying is that, listen, when you have OTT players providing substitute or services that are under license and controlled under that, is it appropriate, right, to then say that, yes, under QoS, I cannot discriminate on net neutrality by allowing any and all apps to function on this network? But then the OTT players continue to put all of this quantum of substance on the network, and we have to maintain QoS, and so therefore we have to continue to make investments in this network, and because of regulatory constraints, have no ability to monetize any and all of this. So I think it goes back to the issue of looking at the whole regulatory regime, which is what the TRAI said. Since the networks of themselves have changed and morphed, let's look at the whole regulatory environment and the systems that are in place.
Allow me to just interject there, Mr. Mathews.
A level playing field. I think it's very, very appropriate.
Right, Mr. Mathews. So again, Mr. Power, the call that is essentially going out is that they are faced with regulatory burdens that other players, digital players, are not faced with, and that is what leads to speculation of a bias and perhaps a regulatory imbalance. How would you address those concerns?
So that regulatory burden is also giving them a regulatory advantage, which is they have exclusive access to spectrum. If every single service provider, app provider in the world had direct access to spectrum instead of having a telecom operator having that control, then fine. I mean, you know, we don't need net neutrality regulations. But it's a public resource given to them under exclusive licenses for a public good, and that needs to be, and therefore they need to ensure that there is neutrality. That question's already been addressed multiple times by the TRAI now. So, you know, let's not even get into that debate. What Mr. Mathews is talking about is same service, same rules. They provide you know, radio services and mobile value-added services. Shouldn't they have to then buy a radio license for it? They provide videos over mobile value-added services. Shouldn't they have to buy a broadcast license for it? You know, all these years, no one else argued same service, same rule. The TV broadcasters didn't, the radio licensees didn't. So the telecom operators wanted their way. Frankly, what the TRAI needs to do is unbundle the service from the access service, and the access service is just a gateway to the internet, not whether it's voice or it's video, because that's the world that's changing. Secondly, in its own in one of its own recommendations, the TRAI has said that telecom operators are faced with a changing environment because of the digital ecosystem. They need to adapt, and we cannot stop the march of technology. So this argument of bringing everyone else down to their level does not hold true. Right. So these are old arguments. They've already lost twice. The country has said that they are in favor of neutrality, and the telecom operators are still continuing to argue against net neutrality. That needs to stop.
Right, Mr. Uppal, let me come to you now. Again, we're running out of time, so I'll be brief here. When we look at the road forward, in principle, perhaps there is some consensus that there is need for regulation, but of course, the design and the structure is what is subject to a great deal of debate. Just a quick takeaway from you as to what would be the ideal formula to move forward with. There are three formulae that the TRAI has prescribed. There's one where it prescribes equal regulatory burden. There's one it says that there should be a functionality-based distinction, and on the back of that, there should be relaxing of the regime that the TSPs currently face. And then there's, of course, the third model that it should be left open to the market. Which is the ideal model that we can perhaps work with to bring about some degree of parity? Mr. Uppal.
Yes, I think there are 2 points I'd make. One, before I answer your question on which is the model, the first point is that it is a red herring to argue that the telcos are only the victims of OTT growth. They are also the beneficiaries of it, given that the large majority of traffic today on the internet, on the networks, is digital traffic, is data traffic, which of course is growing precisely because of OTTs. So I think to that extent, this argument that that the telcos are victims is probably erroneous. The second part of your question is very straightforward to answer in my view. I think there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that the telcos are overburdened with regulatory costs. And I think it is absolutely in order, and it would be in line with international best practices. It is exactly what all mature regulatory regimes do, which is to reduce these regulatory burdens, reduce these costs, in fact, ideally to zero. And that would provide a certain kind of financial, or if you like, levy-based parity between OTT and telcos, which makes sense. But I think to argue that somehow because of a subset of functions being common to the two services and ignoring a huge structural difference between the two types of players would be a fallacy. So I think we need to make sure that these burdens come down, but acknowledge and recognize that internet and telco spaces are two different spaces. The internet has not internet services are over the top services, and they need to be regulated quite differently, and they cannot exist without the telcos enabling them.
Right, Mr. Uppal.
So, telcos can exist without OTTs, but OTTs cannot.
Just a quick 20-second question to you.
Sure.
You're speaking about rationalizing of regulatory burden that would fall under the domain of the DOT. So are you essentially saying that TRAI has no business intervening here?
No, no. I think the TRAI's business is to say that it is untenable for a growing sector of such major and significant critical importance to the economy to have such high overheads in the form of these levies, and that the TRAI must recommend, as it is its right and duty to do, to the DOT that this is no longer acceptable, and is also the cause
Mr.
of
Uppal,
much
it's been a pleasure
bad
to
blood within the industry.
Right.
Thank you.
Right, Mr. Uppal. So this is clearly, as you can see, quite a contentious issue. The TRAI has now thrown the gauntlet open. The comments can be received on that consultation paper by December 12th. So that's essentially what TRAI is proposing. That's a question that has inspired a great deal of debate. We'll continue to see that in the days to come. We would like to thank the panelists on our show, Mr. Pava, Mr. Uppal, as well as Mr. Mathews, for sharing your thoughts and perspective with our viewers. But that's all the time that we have for on this edition of Reporter's Diary. Thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned to CNBC TV18. Money, Money, Money is up next.